New York City in the 1940s was alive with hope and chaos. Soldiers were coming home from the war, factories were roaring, and the skyline was growing higher every month. But beneath all that optimism, there was another story, one that rarely made headlines. For women, New York wasn't just a city that never slept. It was a city that didn't protect them. This was the decade when women gained visibility, independence, and jobs. But it was also a time when danger followed them everywhere. From dark subway tunnels to crowded tenement streets, women in 1940s New York faced risks that the city refused to acknowledge. When World War II began, thousands of men went overseas. That meant women stepped into their jobs, working long hours in factories, hospitals, and offices. For the first time, women walked home late at night alone, took the subway after dark, and lived independently in boarding houses or small apartments. It was a new kind of freedom, but one that came with exposure. The city was booming with soldiers on leave, construction workers, and transient laborers. Crowds meant anonymity, and in that anonymity, women became targets. Police reports from the early 1940s show a rise in assaults, harassment, and disappearances, crimes that were often ignored or underreported. A woman's safety wasn't seen as a civic priority. It was seen as her own responsibility. The police department had no dedicated unit for crimes against women. Most precincts were run entirely by men, and the idea of taking reports about domestic violence or assault was seen as inconvenient or embarrassing. Women who came forward were often asked what they had done to provoke it, a question that silenced more victims than any criminal ever could. In poor neighborhoods like the Lower East Side or the Bronx, overcrowded apartments meant thin walls, no privacy, and little safety. Streetlights were scarce. Tenement stairwells became hiding places for thieves and predators. Newspapers often buried the stories, if they ran them at all. Crime statistics didn't even have a specific category for assaults against women until years later. And even when crimes were reported, investigations rarely followed. Detectives often assumed women were lying or exaggerating. A city study in 1943 quietly admitted that most reported assaults were never solved, not because the suspects were clever, but because no one tried to find them. Then there was the war itself. When the United States entered World War II, New York became a major military port. Thousands of sailors and soldiers passed through every week. They filled bars, nightclubs, and dance halls from Times Square to Brooklyn. Many were young, restless, and drunk, and the city's police force was overwhelmed trying to control the crowds. During wartime, many women were encouraged to support the troops, which often meant socializing with men they didn't know. But the boundaries of safety were constantly blurred. For every smiling photo of a soldier and a factory worker in a newspaper, there were countless women who never made it home. The press rarely covered those stories. It wasn't patriotic to question the behavior of soldiers. So the disappearances, the assaults, the dangers that followed women through alleyways and train stations, those became whispers. And those whispers became fear. Even in places where women were supposed to be safe, hospitals, schools, and workplaces, exploitation thrived. Male supervisors often used their power to threaten or manipulate female employees. There were no workplace protections, no harassment laws, and no unions that took these cases seriously. Many women stayed quiet because they couldn't afford to lose their jobs. Another quiet danger of the 1940s was medical. Abortion was illegal in New York, and birth control was heavily restricted. Women who became pregnant and couldn't support a child were forced into desperate measures, visiting unlicensed clinics, paying strangers in cash, or attempting dangerous home procedures. Thousands were hospitalized for infections or internal injuries. Many didn't survive. Doctors in New York hospitals wrote about it in private notes, but avoided public discussion. The newspapers called them botched surgeries. The reality was that these women were dying because the law left them no choice. And then there was the issue of domestic abuse, something society didn't even have the language to describe properly back then. If a woman was attacked by her husband, police often told her to work it out. Judges almost never pressed charges. It was seen as a family matter, not a crime. In some neighborhoods, women formed informal support networks, quietly housing each other, warning one another about dangerous men, and sharing information about safe doctors or trustworthy employers. These underground systems of protection were acts of survival in a city that wasn't built to protect them. Even transportation, something as simple as riding the subway, came with risk. The subways were dimly lit, poorly monitored, and packed with strangers. There were countless reports of women being groped or followed. One city report in 1945 called it the hidden crisis of the underground. But again, no reforms came. And while crime rose, the city's response remained rooted in image. The mayor's office and police department preferred to promote New York as a safe and modern metropolis. Anything that threatened that reputation, especially stories of women in danger, was quietly buried. But there were exceptions. Some journalists and activists began speaking up. The Women's City Club of New York started pushing for better street lighting and police patrols. Social reformers like Belle Moskowitz and Clara Driscoll had spent years campaigning for safer housing and worker protections. Their efforts laid the groundwork for post-war reforms, though they came too late for many. The media sometimes broke through the silence. One chilling case from 1946 involved a young woman found dead near Riverside Park. Police labeled it a crime of passion, a phrase that dismissed the reality that violence against women wasn't passion, it was power. Cases like hers rarely saw justice, and as the decade closed, the city's population grew. The post-war years brought new energy, but also new waves of danger. Crime syndicates, black markets, and corrupt officials thrived in the chaos of transition. For women, especially working-class women, that meant navigating a city where every street corner could hold both opportunity and threat. Looking back, the 1940s were a turning point. Women were stepping into independence, but society hadn't caught up. There were no laws protecting them from harassment, no safety nets for survivors, and no guarantee that anyone would believe them if they spoke up. The war gave women freedom, the right to work, to earn, to live alone, but it also took away safety. And when the soldiers returned, many of those same women were told to give up their jobs, go back home, and disappear quietly into domestic life. For some, that meant safety. For others, it meant silence all over again. So why was 1940s New York the most dangerous place for women? Because it was a city in denial, a place that celebrated progress while ignoring pain. It was a city where a woman could walk down Broadway and feel free, yet never truly be safe. And even now, when people romanticize that era, the fashion, the jazz, the film noir streets, they rarely think about the women who walk those streets at night, keys clutched in their hands, hoping to make it home. The truth is, the danger wasn't just in the alleys or the shadows. It was in the culture itself, in the silence, in the shame, in the way people refused to see what was right in front of them. But those women kept walking. They kept working. They built the New York we know today. And even though their stories were rarely told, they're the reason the city eventually changed. Because every woman who refused to stay quiet, everyone who demanded to be seen, to be safe, to be equal, was part of a revolution that began in fear and ended in strength. The 1940s may have been one of the most dangerous times for women in New York's history, but it was also the decade that forced the city to open its eyes and start building something better.